Part 4. Progress and Pain, 1965 to 1980. Chapter 21. The Hidden People. Gordon Marshall brought the Cessna 185 low over the dense forest trees. We'd removed the right-hand door of the plane before taking off, and the wind was blasting in with a steady roar, adding to the engine noise. The interior of the cabin, all its rear seats removed, was filled with sacks. Standing amongst them, I fixed a rope to one of the cargo tie-down rings and then secured it round my waist, knotting it well. The trees, about 100 feet below, were flashing quickly by. Gordon pushed the propeller control to maximum safe revs. The sound of the engine increased as it sped up. He lowered the flaps, easing the throttle open at the same time to give more power and to stop us losing too much speed. Now, flying fairly slowly, we levelled out. Suddenly I saw we were over a clearing. "Now!" shouted Gordon above the wind and engine roar. I pushed a sack out and watched it tumble towards the ground. Gordon opened the throttle and started climbing, then banked as we circled and came round over the clearing again. I pushed another sack out, very thankful that I had the rope round my waist. Below I had a fleeting glimpse of an old friend, Harvey Hoekstra. I could see his familiar khaki shorts, short-sleeved shirt, and white pith helmet. Some of the forest dwellers were standing with him, all looking up and waving. It was May 1966. Gordon and I were over Gadari, in the dense rainforests of southwest Ethiopia. Harvey and Lavina Hoekstra were working there with a people who the Ethiopian government called the Misengo, but the people themselves called their tribe the Majang. A year before, the Hoekstras had trekked for 7 days through unknown forest to reach this place. They had brought with them their 3-year-old son, Paul. Right from their arrival, they'd relied on MAF for supplies. In 3 months, 40 drops had been made with food, medical supplies, tools, building material, and so on. For the MAF crew, this was exciting and exacting flying. For the Hoekstras, it was a lifeline. Since then, Harvey had paid a large number of tribesmen to clear an airstrip and allow the plane to land. This had now been in use for some months. Gordon and I had flown to Ethiopia in the Kenyan Cessna 185 to collect first-hand news of the progress there and share it with MAF supporters at home. We had been reenacting the earlier supply drops for the benefit of a missionary photographer from Addis Ababa who was taking pictures from the ground. We landed on the slightly upsloping strip. Rain and mist were settling over the forest-clad hills. Storms were close, so we tied the plane down securely. I saw that many of the trees around us were well over 130 feet tall. Some were 12 feet in diameter. Hanging vines writhed around them, and dense bush surrounded their bases. Chattering black and white colobus monkeys scrambled up and down in the branches. Harvey joined us, a group of Majang with him. We studied them with interest. They were rather like the Anuak, only shorter, handsome, with friendly, smiling faces. They wore loincloths, leaves, or occasionally shorts, with coloured beads, white, red, yellow and blue, in rings round their necks, arms and waists. Some carried spears. Others had ancient rifles brought back from distant trading posts. Everyone in Ethiopia seemed to have guns. Some of them held little musical instruments, small wooden bases on which they'd mounted thin metal reeds of different lengths. When plucked, these produced a curiously plaintive musical tune. They greeted us, "Digoi." We replied likewise, "Digoi." Harvey seemed to be conversing easily with them. The deep forest felt comparatively cool as we walked through it to the Majang-built house where the Hoekstras were living. It was very basic, the walls made of upright bark-covered poles, tightly laced together with vine rope, the roof loosely thatched with grass, the unglazed windows just large openings in the walls. Lavina laid a tablecloth ready for a meal. She could make a place seem like home, even in the remotest bush. I was surprised to see her put some red roses on the table. "Roses? Here in the jungle?" I asked. "We brought a rose bush in with us." "You mean Harvey allowed you to haul that in all the way through the forest?" "Yes, he did. We also brought rabbits." "Rabbits? You didn't bring pets in as well?" "No, they were for breeding for food. We brought chickens too, and Harvey has developed a vegetable garden." The story went back some years. The American mission had focused its concern on 7 remote tribes in southwestern Ethiopia. Some were lost tribes, inaccessible to the government, traders, and even other tribes. The mission had decided to send one missionary family to each of them, including some of the families who had been forced to leave the Sudan. MAF had carried out aerial surveys to chart a few of the tribal locations. One of these belonged to the Majang. A ground party of 4 missionaries, including Harvey, travelled 150 miles on foot through thick forest to reach the Majang territory. They struggled through heavy undergrowth and clinging vines, across rivers and streams, over slippery moss-covered rocks, and often through squelching mud and driving rain. Much of the journey was so deep in the forest that little daylight was visible. Towards the end of their journey, one of them contracted a dangerous blood infection. The team came out with Majangs carrying him on a stretcher. Though wearied by the trip, the missionaries were sure God had shown them where to start work among these people. The site was on the Godari River, close to the home of Balti, the paramount chief of the tribe. It had been one thing for a party of men to find their way through the forest to the Majang. It was a more formidable proposition for Harvey to go in with Lavina and Paul. But they did it, carrying supplies, a tent and bedrolls, a little MAF radio transmitter, and a car battery to run it. Harvey told me the story of their journey. "We started out from Tepe, the nearest government airfield. It took us several hours to get carriers organized and 6 mules loaded. Within a minute, hoofs went flying in the air, and 3 mules kicked their loads off, scattering our things in every direction. Mercifully, they were in a gentler frame of mind when we arrived at our first stop, 10 miles ahead. We set up our tent with the light of a candle. A cloudburst struck at 3:30 a.m. We got cold and wet. Our rabbits and chickens drew hordes of army ants during the night. The ants weren't satisfied with just eating chicken and rabbit either. Even at best, the trail was barely passable. Vines, thorns and brush, fallen trees, and 10 or 11 river crossings all slowed us down. Once I turned my head just in time to see Paul pulled backwards off his horse, with a vine wrapped tightly around his neck. He had a bandage around his neck the rest of the journey. Lavina got thrown off a horse at one of the river crossings. On our second morning, our carriers put down their loads and refused to go further. Things looked pretty bleak. Fortunately, they had a change of heart and returned to take our things on to the next village. Once in Majang country, we found it different. Local chiefs were helpful and rounded up whole families, with men, women, and even children, each carrying something. They'd take us on to a nearby settlement, where they helped us to find new carriers. The last morning we set up our transmitter and called MAF to come with supplies for us. The MAF crew couldn't see exactly where we were, down amidst the dense forest trees, but we were able to guide them to us by giving directions on the radio. They made 2 drops of blankets, food, and grain. As they sped away, the huge black clouds rolled in, and heavy rain fell. When darkness came, we were exhausted, drenched and hungry. We slept that night in wet bedrolls with a single mosquito net stretched crossways over our 3 heads. We were glad when daylight broke. That morning, Balti, the local chief, turned up with about 30 men, and they built 2 glorified Majang shacks for us. Those first days brought scores of Majang out of the forest to see these strange white people. They moved right in with us. They came in through the door and through the window openings too. They stayed and watched everything we did. When the airstrip was ready, Tom Frank and Hugh Beck had made a further trek through the forest to check it. Then Bob Hutchins flew in, and after further careful inspection from the air, landed. As he taxied slowly up to the higher end, the Majang workers, cheering and clapping, broke into a run behind him. Soon everyone was around the plane, talking excitedly in various languages. In the months that followed, the plane regularly brought in food and supplies, and sometimes visitors or helpers. In particular, it brought building supplies, including prefabricated sections from the mission's workshop, 60 miles away. These were carefully designed to fit into the small MAF Cessna. Bricks were made locally from mud and sand from the local river. Building at Gadari progressed rapidly. A better house for Harvey and Lavina, a clinic, a church, and a schoolroom soon sprang up underneath the giant forest trees. Things were still not easy. Once, Harvey nearly lost his life. Returning from a preaching trip to another village, he found that all the Majang men at Gadari, including the chief, were completely drunk. One of them tried to hit Harvey. Another threatened him with a loaded gun. A third, called Okor, nearly speared him, as the Aukas had speared Nate Saint in the Ecuadorian jungle 10 years before. In God's providence, several brave Majang women knocked down the man with the gun before he could fire, and Harvey was able to escape from Okor's spear. The next day, the chief and the others were sober. Minds were clear again. They came and clasped hands with Harvey, Majang fashion, to say how sorry they were. The man with the gun said he thanked God that he had not been allowed to do what he had wanted. Okor clasped Harvey's hand in both of his to show his sorrow. They went out of their way to help the Hooksters understand they must not fear them. Paradoxically, the aftermath of that terrifying episode showed how much the Majang had really come to care for Harvey and Lavina. A year later, there were over 100 of them meeting regularly to worship God. Amongst those Harvey had baptized was Okor, who in turn helped many others to know Christ. A group of Majang chose 5 strategic places where they hoped to establish new congregations of believers and sent 2 of their number to each. What God had been leading the missions to do, he was now leading the Majang to do as well. Almost daily, Majang evangelists were taking out sturdy little hand-turned cassette players with taped messages prepared by Harvey. A new group of believers was baptized. Others had to wait until they made a break with their spirit worship and the shrines in their villages. Harvey wrote, "Instead of superstition and fear, men are beginning to live a new life of freedom in the love of Christ. Where once they trusted in the sprinkled blood of a chicken, or walked under its carcass to protect them from deadly smallpox, the Majang are now coming to the clinic for inoculations. Difficult medical cases, instead of being left without hope, can now be flown to one of our mission hospitals for surgery and treatment. Where Jesus Christ is unknown, there is darkness, superstition, and despair. But here in the forest, where his name enters, light shines and men are set free." Through the early months, we could not have stayed here apart from MAF's airdrops. But we came to this forest because a whole tribe lives here who had never heard the message of Jesus Christ. In one village, where I was out with the tape player, the Majang turned to each other and said, "Why have we never heard this word before?"